So folks are filing in now, and we'll officially start in about 30 to 60 seconds.
This is the awkward part where we sit awkwardly as people come in and see us. So that's always the fun part.
I've never done this before for a book presentation, so this is fun.
Yes, awesome. Awesome. It is fun. It's good. You'll like it.
And as folks are filing in, feel free to let us know in the chat where you're joining us from. So certainly optional, but if you feel so inclined, let us know what city and town or state you're joining us from. And same thing for the folks who are watching on Facebook. I know we're going to have, over the course of the next week, these videos will probably get thousands of views. But if you're watching live, let us know in the comments where you're joining us from. All right, quite a diverse set of locations already. And Eleanor, your fan club president has arrived.
Who is that?
Tim Kim, or Kim. Tim Kim.
Oh, my friend. Okay.
All right, excellent. Well, we're about a minute in, so why don't I get started? And I do expect some more folks to trickle in, but out of respect for those that are here on time, we will get moving. So I am going to bore you all with about 3 minutes here of required reading, and then we'll get to the good stuff. So good evening, and thanks for being with us for the next hour to hear from best-selling author Eleanor Herman for a discussion on her new book, Sex with Presidents: The Ins and Outs of Love and Lust in the White House. My name is Robert Hayes. I'm the Community Outreach Librarian and Head of Technical Services at the Tewksbury Public Library. And tonight, behind the scenes, I'm joined by Erin Driscoll, who's the Adult Services Librarian at the Wilmington Memorial Library. I'd like to make a few quick points before introducing tonight's moderator, author Rick Beyer, who will then introduce Eleanor. So first, I'd like to thank everyone behind the scenes for making this event possible. This is a collaboration between 6 North of Boston libraries. I'd like to thank Stephanie from Andover, Lizzie and Sharon from Billerica, Lynn from North Reading, Rebecca from Woburn, and Charlotte, Erin, Emily, and Brad from Wilmington. I'd also like to thank Allison from HarperCollins and Jane from Wellesley Books. Second thing I want to just point out is this event is part of a virtual series of best-selling author visits. Our next author visit is next Saturday, October 3rd at 7 o'clock. We'll be hosting Craig Johnson, who's the author of the Longmire Western Mystery Series, which is the basis for the hit Netflix original series. Craig will be discussing his latest Longmire book called Next to Last Stand, and he'll be doing so in conversation with best-selling author and local TV investigative reporter Hank Philippi Ryan.
Oh, Hank.
Third, just want folks to be aware that this event is currently being live streamed on the Wilmington Memorial Library's Facebook page. Please give them a like and give the video a like, and feel free to share this video with anyone who you may feel would be interested in it. We've found that thousands of people watch these videos in part or in full on Facebook within a few days of posting. Almost done. Let's see. Fourth, just want you all to be aware that you'll be receiving a feedback survey tomorrow. Please let us know what you thought of today's event and what you'd like to see for future events. Also in the feedback survey will be a link to purchase an autographed copy of Eleanor's latest book from Wellesley Book, our bookstore partner, who will ship it directly to you. And finally, to set expectations, I anticipate this event lasting approximately an hour. Rick is going to introduce Eleanor. Eleanor has a slideshow presentation she's going to share. Rick will then ask Eleanor several questions, and then we'll turn to the audience, and Rick will take questions from the Q&A box. So you must type your questions into the Q&A box. The comments go in the comment box, and the questions go into the Q&A box. and Erin and I will be monitoring both, and Rick will be selecting questions from the Q&A box. All right, so let me introduce tonight's moderator, Rick Beyer. Rick is a New York Times bestselling author, an award-winning documentary producer, and a longtime history enthusiast. His most recent book, Rivals Unto Death, Hamilton and Burr, explores the 3-decade rivalry that led to their infamous duel. His independent documentary, The Ghost Army, premiered on PBS in 2013 and won a CINE Golden Eagle Award. It tells the story of an extraordinary World War II unit that used creativity and illusion to fool the Germans. He also co-authored a best-selling book on the unit that is being developed into a Hollywood film. Rick has produced numerous other documentaries and is the author of the popular Greatest Stories Never Told series of history books. And that is a very abbreviated version of Rick's bio, who perhaps might expand on it just a little. So let's give a big round of applause to Rick for joining us here tonight. And Rick, you can take it away. Thanks so much.
Well, thank you, Rob, so much. And I'm really so glad to be here and be moderating this program and introducing Eleanor and talking to her. I've been reading her most recent book. I've written about presidents myself, being The Greatest Presidential Stories Never Told, being one of my books. And she's got some presidential stories never told in there as well. And so I think you're going to be really pleased to hear from her. Let me not waste any time, though, and tell you about our guest tonight, Eleanor Herman. She is the New York Times bestselling author of Sex with Kings, Sex with the Queen, and several other works of popular history. She's hosted Lost Worlds for the History Channel, The Madness of Henry VIII for the National Geographic Channel, and 2 seasons of America Fact versus Fiction for the American Heroes Channel. Now, I am told that Eleanor writes in a home office filled with historical artifacts, paintings of dead people, 4 sleeping cats, and a very naughty rescue dog. Is that where you're joining us from, Eleanor? Is the said office? Well, I don't know why the dog is naughty, in what ways the dog is naughty. Perhaps Eleanor will expand on that later on. But her main reason for being here is to talk about her latest book, Sex with Presidents: The Ins and Outs of Love and Lust in the White House. And so Eleanor has been digging into the bedroom secrets of American presidents, and I have to say, come up with some fascinating stuff. And Eleanor, as I said, I've really enjoyed reading your book. I'm looking forward to hearing from you tonight. Ladies and gentlemen, we welcome Eleanor Herman.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Rick. And thanks to Robert Hayes and Aaron Driscoll and the library for hosting me at this event. This is really exciting because it's my first Zoom book event. So we'll see how this goes. Normally I'm flying around and I go up to a podium, and here I am still sitting in the same exact chair I have been sitting in since the 13th of March. So I'm going to start off by attempting to share my screen. Aha. Whoa, it worked. Okay. That's fabulous. So my first book, as Rick mentioned, was Sex with Kings, which looked at the lives of European royal mistresses. And my second was Sex with the Queen, which examined queens who had love affairs. And recently, what with all the allegations of the bad behavior of the current resident of the White House, I decided it was time to explore sex with presidents. So as a descendant of Mayflower pilgrims myself, I've always been aware of a strong streak of Puritan prudery in our national culture, despite the hundreds of millions of immigrants to this country from every part of the world. And here we see some of my forefathers who were not exactly a barrel of laughs. So going into researching this book, I assumed that until fairly recently, American voters, unlike their European counterparts, must have been horrified by any political sex scandals and would mostly not have voted for any candidates embroiled in them. And I could not have been more wrong. The first US political sex scandal involved not a president, but one of our founding fathers. Alexander Hamilton was quite influential in writing and interpreting the Constitution, and he was the first secretary of the US Treasury. Handsome and flirtatious, he was happily married to a lovely woman, Elizabeth, and they had a growing brood of children when, in 1791, the 34-year-old Hamilton began an affair with 23-year-old Maria Reynolds. Unfortunately, we don't have a picture of Maria, but she must have been scintillatingly sexy because she had quite an effect on men. And since I just couldn't stand that there was no portrait of Maria, I came up with two pictures of what she could have looked like based on the time period. So Maria and her husband, James, had actually set up the affair as part of a blackmail scheme. Hamilton paid them a lot of money. Even he kept having the affair with Maria. He finally broke it off within a year, but he had written Maria a lot of letters. When the scandal broke in the press in 1796, leaked by Hamilton's arch enemy, Thomas Jefferson, Hamilton was accused of more than just having an extramarital affair. His political opponents saw the blackmail payments to James Reynolds as proof that Hamilton was using him to speculate in government investments on his behalf, thereby breaking Hamilton's own anti-speculation laws and reaping an illegal fortune. Instead of denying the affair, which I think a lot of politicians would have done, Hamilton wrote a 100-page pamphlet admitting it, including every letter he, Maria, and James had written each other, but denying breaking any laws. The American public appreciated his honesty. They didn't really care about his sex life, but they would have been furious if he had been financially corrupt. And his reputation suffered little damage in the long run. In 1787, the widower, Thomas Jefferson, the US ambassador to Paris, wanted to bring his 9-year-old daughter, Polly, over from Virginia to join him and her 15-year-old sister. There were difficulties in finding a suitable companion to look after Polly on the journey, and ultimately one of Jefferson's enslaved people on his plantation of Monticello, 14-year-old Sally Hemings, was given the task. Sally was his late wife's half-sister, as Martha Jefferson's father had had several children with one of his enslaved women. So on the left is Jefferson during his tenure as the US ambassador to France, and on the right is a photo from the movie Belle that came out a few years ago. There is no portrait, unfortunately, of Sally, but this is how I imagine her to have looked in France. She would have been dressed to the nines as the lady's maid of the US ambassador's daughters and would have gone to the court of Versailles with them to see King Louis XVI and Queen Marie Antoinette. We don't know when a sexual relationship began, but when Jefferson went back to Virginia 2 years later, 16-year-old Sally Hemings was pregnant. Now, she could have obtained her freedom by staying in France, but Jefferson persuaded her to return to Virginia with him, promising he would free their children when they turned 21, and she complied. They had 7 children over the next 20 years, 4 of whom lived to adulthood. And when Jefferson was president in his first term, a muckraking hack journalist discovered that the president had a relationship with his enslaved woman and several children with her, and he wrote the most scathing articles about them, hoping to make Jefferson lose the 1804 election. But American voters were happy with Jefferson's strong economy, low taxes, and the triumph of the Louisiana Purchase the year before, when he had doubled the size of the country at a pen stroke. Few cared about his relationship with Sally Hemings, and it appears the two remained faithful to each other until Jefferson's death in 1826. Few people knew that we likely had a gay president, James Buchanan, who was the president right before Abraham Lincoln. Buchanan, it seems, had a 13-year affair with a man, William Rufus King, who was vice president in 1853 and died in office. Indeed, James Buchanan is the only US president who never married. In Washington, the two of them were known as Mr. and Mrs. Buchanan, or Miss Nancy and Aunt Fancy, terms at the time used to denote gay men. And when King served as ambassador to France in 1844, Buchanan wrote a friend, "I am so solitary and alone, having no companion with me. I have gone wooing to several gentlemen, but have not succeeded with any of them." This story, by the way, never made it into the press. In 1873, Grover Cleveland, a 36-year-old bachelor, lawyer, and sheriff of Buffalo, New York, was courting 33-year-old Maria Halpin, a lovely widow with 2 children who sold clothing at a large department store. One night, he raped her, and she became pregnant. She begged him to marry her to salvage the situation, and he refused. When she had the baby, Cleveland took him away and gave him to a childless friend to adopt. He then put Maria in an insane asylum against her will, and she managed to get out after a few days. Fast forward 10 years, and Cleveland, who in the interim had been mayor of Buffalo and governor of New York State, is running for president with a national reputation for rooting out corruption, cutting taxes, and genuine accountability to his constituents. After Cleveland was nominated as Democratic candidate, people who knew about what had happened to Maria leaked the story to the press. Interestingly, Cleveland did not deny it. He was actually furious with his campaign staff, who painted Maria as a whore sleeping with several of his friends at the time. And Maria, to defend herself, jumped into the fray and told her side of the story. The whole country was in an uproar about it for several weeks right before the election. Cleveland's opponent, Republican candidate James Blaine, had a spotless private life, but stole money hand over fist from the government in a series of dirty deals. So, how would the American public vote? For a sanctified sex life or for a rapist who would save them taxes? Well, they voted for the rapist, and at the height of the Victorian era. Here is a cartoon during the campaign showing Maria with a squalling infant. Cleveland's opponents kept heckling him at rallies, screaming, "Ma, Ma, where's my pa?" And after he won the election, his supporters cried, "Gone to the White House, ha, ha, ha." In 1886, Cleveland, then a 49-year-old bachelor, married the lovely Frances Folsom, who at 21 is the youngest First Lady the United States has ever had. In 1908, Woodrow Wilson was the president of Princeton University and happily married to his wife of 20 years, Ellen, pictured on the right. He went to Bermuda for several weeks that winter to reduce his blood pressure, which was sky high due to stress. And while doctors could measure blood pressure, they had no medication to reduce it, so they just prescribed relaxation. It was there in Bermuda that Wilson met a charming married socialite named Mary Hulbert Peck on the left, and he began a heated affair with her that lasted several years, though it cooled off once he became president in 1912. When Ellen Wilson died of kidney disease in 1914, many believed that Wilson would, after a suitable period of mourning, marry Mary, who was by then divorced. But they were wrong. Just a few months after he lost his wife, the grieving president met a Washington, D.C. socialite, the wealthy widow Edith Galt, and he was completely smitten. After a torrid courtship, they married. When Wilson had a series of debilitating strokes in 1919, it was Edith Wilson, who had left school at the age of 14, who was effectively running the country. She would take papers from senators and cabinet officials, go into her husband's darkened sick room, and pretend to get instructions from him, though he was often crying and unable to speak. It was because of her that the 25th Amendment was passed, providing measures to ensure that the vice president becomes acting president if the president is unable to discharge the powers of duties of his office. Warren Harding was quite a ladies' man. There was something about him, photographs just don't do it justice, that turned otherwise normal women into howling cats in heat. Widows, teenagers, socialites, actresses, respectable married women followed him around, begging to bed him, and he usually complied. This drove his long-suffering wife, Florence, mad with jealousy. My favorite story is the one where Florence, told by her Secret Service agent that Warren was having sex with a girl in the Oval Office, went banging on the door, but was prevented from entering by one of Warren's Secret Service agents. And by the time she did enter, the girl had been spirited away, and Harding was sitting innocently at his desk perusing some papers. Harding was unwise enough to write his lovers 50-page pornographic letters, which many of them sold back to the Republican National Committee when he became the Republican candidate in 1920. And Harding, who was a kind-hearted, financially honest soul, felt that he had to repay these donors after he won the election by giving them cabinet positions. Unfortunately, they robbed the country blind, and most of the scandal came out after his sudden death in 1923 from heart failure. But the scandals ruined his legacy. Something else tarnished Warren Harding's reputation. He had had an affair with a young woman named Nan Britton, who had a daughter she claimed was his. After Harding's death, Nan didn't have the money to support her daughter, and she asked the Harding family for support. They turned her down and said it was not Harding's daughter. So Nan wrote the first presidential sex scandal tell-all, a book called The President's Daughter, and she made a fortune. And in 2015, a DNA test of Nan's grandson and Harding's great-nephew proved the child had been the president's after all. In 1905, 23-year-old Franklin Roosevelt married a distant cousin, 21-year-old Eleanor Roosevelt, against his mother's wishes. He loved Eleanor for her seriousness, her kindness, and intelligence, while all the other debutantes he found flighty and flirtatious. But alas, the bride and groom were ill-suited. Franklin loved sex, and he loved feminine, soothing women who had a great sense of humor. Turns out Eleanor hated sex, had almost no sense of humor, hectored him constantly, and seemed to grow less feminine as time wore on. In 1916, Franklin began an affair with Eleanor's social secretary, Lucy Mercer. And here she is on the left at about the time the affair began, and on the right about 20 years later. Lucy was everything Franklin wanted in a woman: smiling, soothing, laughing, and very feminine. When Eleanor found out about the affair in 1918, she demanded a divorce, and Franklin eagerly agreed. He wanted to marry Lucy, the love of his life. But his mother, who held the purse strings and paid all of Franklin's bills, announced she would cut him off without a dime. So Franklin and Eleanor stayed together, but never more as man and wife. Lucy married an extremely wealthy older man, but she never entirely gave up Franklin. Behind Eleanor's back, the two continued to see each other, and they never fell out of love. In fact, Lucy was with Franklin in April 1945 when he had his fatal stroke. But Franklin had another long-term mistress, Missy LeHand, his secretary of 20 years. Efficient, charming, feminine, she lived in the White House and was seen wafting in and out of the president's bedroom at all hours. To take dictation, she said, though servants reported seeing her in her nightgown with no steno pad in hand. Eleanor Roosevelt, too, was not without consolation. Just as she became First Lady in 1933, she began an affair with a journalist named Lorena Hickok, known as Hick, a star reporter for the Associated Press. The affair ended after a couple of years. Eleanor became an international star, working for civil rights, women's rights, and helping the underprivileged. And she just didn't have time for Hick anymore. Though she took care of Hick, who later suffered from diabetes and went blind until her dying day. In 1942, General Dwight Eisenhower was working in London on an invasion of Nazi-occupied Europe. In England, all of the street signs had been taken down so that if the Germans landed, they would be totally confused as to where to go. So the top American military brass had to use local drivers who knew every street in London and for miles around by heart. Eisenhower, as luck would have it, was assigned a beautiful, vibrant 33-year-old driver named Kay Summersby. And while waiting to drive him around, she started helping in his office and soon became his top aide. They often spent 16 hours a day, 7 days a week, working and relaxing together with some of his other aides. And when her fiancé stepped on a landmine in North Africa, Eisenhower and Kay Summersby realized they had actually been in love a long time. He talked about leaving his wife, Mamie, shown here, and marrying Kay, and about having a child with her. But on the 2 occasions they tried to have sex, according to Kay, he just couldn't do it. And soon after the second time, after the war had been won, he was sent back to Washington and called his entire staff to join him at the Pentagon, except for Kay, and it broke her heart. The man who faced down Hitler didn't have the courage to tell Kay face to face that it was over. As she wrote her autobiography in the 1970s while she was dying of cancer, she made it very clear that she had never stopped loving him. JFK and Jackie were the most attractive first couple ever, but the American public had no idea what a sham their marriage was. Jack Kennedy was a pathological philanderer. At a big party on their Mexican honeymoon, Jack disappeared with a woman, leaving his wife alone in utter humiliation. When Jackie gave birth to a stillborn daughter, he and his brother Teddy were sailing the Mediterranean with 3 Swedish blondes, and Jack didn't see why he should come back to visit his wife in the hospital. Jackie wanted to leave him before they had children, but her father-in-law bribed her to stay in the marriage, afraid that a divorced man could never become president. And after she had her daughter Caroline, she probably realized she was stuck with him. It is possible that Kennedy had an antibiotic-resistant strain of chlamydia, which he gave Jackie, which might explain why out of 5 pregnancies, she only had 2 living children. Living with such a shameless philanderer, she grew depressed and started using prescription drugs to deaden the pain. Before she became First Lady, she had an affair with Hollywood actor William Holden, and in the months before her husband's assassination, she had another one with Aristotle Onassis, whom she later married. Jack Kennedy had sex several times a day with all kinds of women, socialites, several of his White House employees, actresses, prostitutes. He liked to have sex with these women in his wife's bed when she was out of the White House, which was often because she just really couldn't take it very much. The First Lady had her own suite in the residence and the president had his, but he made it a point to have sex with these women on his wife's bed. And afterwards, he didn't even call the household staff to have her sheets changed. He made the Secret Service and the housekeepers pick hairs and bobby pins off Jackie's sheets instead of changing them. One night, the First Lady slipped into bed, put her arm under her pillow, and found a pair of women's panties under the pillow. She dangled them from her finger and told her husband to please find the owner, as they were not in her size. Jack Kennedy often had orgies in the White House swimming pool, which is still under the press briefing room you see on television today. So on the right, we see one of the president's lovers, Marilyn Monroe, singing "Happy Birthday, Mr. President" at Madison Square Garden in 1962. It was so obvious to everyone who saw them that night that they were having an affair. They practically oozed sex that Jack dumped her right away, handing her over to his brother Bobby to console her, and boy, did he. On the left is Mimi Beardsley, a 19-year-old intern in the White House press office in 1962, whom Jack invited to see the president's private quarters one night. And he forced her down on Jackie's bed and had sex with her. Mimi didn't call it rape in her memoir she wrote years later. She wrote that she was just so shocked, she just let it happen. But she did go home that night in a taxi, sad that she would no longer be a virgin on her wedding night. This is Judith Campbell, who had a multi-year affair with JFK at the same time. She was the mistress of Sam Giancana, the Chicago mob boss who took over from Al Capone. So this presented the president with a huge security risk, but he didn't care. According to Judith's memoir, even after FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover told the president the mafia could record them and use this to blackmail the president of the United States, Kennedy continued to see her. This is Ellen Romech, an East German call girl who had an affair with JFK. And J. Edgar Hoover investigated her too and found she was probably a spy for the Soviet Union. Attorney General Bobby Kennedy was horrified and convinced his brother finally to take national security seriously. And Ellen was sent packing to Germany. Usually JFK was completely reckless in his disregard for both his personal safety and national security when it came to his sex life. Women would appear at the White House saying the president was waiting for him, and the Secret Service knew they had to let them in without vetting them. The president was in no mood to wait, apparently, and any one of them could have killed the president, especially as they often prepared food in the private kitchen of the residence after sex, and there were so many knives lying around. Now, when Kennedy knew he was going to entertain a woman in his private quarters, he let the staff know not to come up there. The White House electrician reported that one night when he went in the elevator to go up to a higher floor and change a light bulb, he pushed the wrong button. And when the doors opened, to his horror, he found himself on the residential floor with a blonde White House secretary running towards him, completely naked, breasts swinging, and he quickly pushed the button to close the doors. Lyndon Johnson came from a dirt poor Texas childhood, but had a brilliant mind for politics. In the early 30s, he was a congressman's aide with aspirations of becoming president, if only he could find a rich wife. He met Lady Bird Taylor and swept her off her feet. Still, that didn't stop him from having love affairs. His steamiest relationship was with Alice Glass, the 6-foot-tall, red-haired mistress of an important newspaper tycoon. There was talk in Washington about whether Lyndon would leave his wife to marry Alice, but the fact is, no matter how badly he at times treated Lady Bird, he idolized her. And after she accepted the fact that he needed to have women on the side, it was a happy marriage. One day as First Lady, Lady Bird walked into the Oval Office to find her husband having sex with a secretary on the sofa. She excused herself and backed out. Lyndon was so furious, he had a buzzer system installed so that when Lady Bird came toward the Oval Office, the Secret Service would buzz him and he would have time to pull his pants up and sit back down at his desk examining papers. So in the first few slides, I discussed the muckraking journalism that attacked Alexander Hamilton, Thomas Jefferson, and Grover Cleveland for their sexual indiscretions. But that kind of media stopped right around 1900. Journalism, which had been seen as a rather sordid trade, became a respected profession. The National Press Club was formed with a code of journalistic ethics, and gentlemen didn't write about other gentlemen's love affairs. Though political journalists knew all about Woodrow Wilson's Mrs. Peck and Warren Harding's hundreds of girlfriends and Franklin Roosevelt's Lucy Mercer and Missy LeHand and JFK's affairs with Marilyn Monroe and countless others, they never reported it. Then a few things happened. The Vietnam War and Lyndon Johnson's lies about it tarnished the reputation of the presidency. Teddy Kennedy's drunken careening off a bridge at Chappaquiddick killed a young woman, made a lot of reporters feel guilty as they had known for years he was a drunken mess and they had never written a word about it. Most importantly, Watergate happened. Suddenly, presidents were not to be protected by journalists, they were to be investigated. And almost immediately after Watergate, all the stories about JFK and his women tumbled out into the press. The first presidential contender to learn the hard way that times had changed was Gary Hart, a popular senator from Colorado who in 1987 seemed like a sure thing to become the Democratic candidate the following year. In May of that year, reporters at the Miami Herald received an anonymous tip that a blonde would be visiting Hart at his Capitol Hill townhouse one weekend, and they staked out his house. They found him there with Donna Rice, a 27-year-old model who apparently spent that Friday night with him. Hart was outraged that anyone would intrude into his personal life, and he denied having an affair with Rice, but it seemed pretty clear to everyone that he was lying. Not just lying, but lying in an obnoxious, pontificating, holier-than-thou way. Polls showed that 2/3 of Americans didn't care about his love life, but they didn't like being lied to. Hart dropped out of the race in disgrace. If he had asked forgiveness with tears in his eyes, perhaps he could have stayed in. The next presidential candidate with a scandalous personal life was Bill Clinton. He had, in fact, been planning on entering the 1988 race until he saw what happened to Gary Hart, and then he quickly changed his mind. By 1991, when he entered the race, he had his story straight. He would tell the press his marriage had had problems, but that was all in the past. When, however, early in 1992, a nightclub singer named Jennifer Flowers came forward alleging a 12-year affair with Clinton in Arkansas, Bill denied it. And during the campaign, Hillary hired a private eye and other staff to dig into the past lives of any woman, and there must have been quite a few, who might make a similar allegation and scare them into staying quiet or ruining their reputations if they did not. Voters, however, didn't seem to care about the likes of Jennifer Flowers. What did land Bill Clinton in a tub of very hot water was his affair with a 22-year-old White House intern, Monica Lewinsky. And once again, it was his lies that got him in trouble, not the sex. During an investigation, Clinton lied to special prosecutors about it, perjuring himself, whereas Monica had DNA proof on a little blue dress in the freezer. And it was this that got Clinton impeached, though he was not removed from office. Oddly, the final week of his impeachment, Clinton's ratings were the highest ever, 73%. Many Americans felt that he was the victim of sexual McCarthyism, and he had only lied about sex after all, and everybody lies about sex, right? So by the time we hit the late 1990s, Americans don't even care anymore if politicians lie to them about sex, which was a good thing for the next president involved in a sex scandal. Even evangelical Christians who were furious at Clinton's antics with women understand that Trump has always been a playboy and a ladies' man, cheating on all 3 of his wives and lying about it, and they don't care. Most of Trump's supporters don't even care about the numerous allegations of sexual assault or his boasting about it on tape. And I think this means that we are living in a post-sex scandal world. The current Trump sex scandal is that in paying off 2 women for their silence shortly before the 2016 election, Playboy Playmate of the Year Karen McDougal and adult film star Stormy Daniels, Trump may have violated campaign finance regulations, and this investigation is still going forward. It's a similar situation to that of Bill Clinton in that if both men had just said, yeah, I did it, I'm ashamed of myself, I owe an apology to my wife and the American people, there would have been no legal repercussions. That is what Trump should have done with these 2 ladies. And from now on, that is really what every politician involved in a similar situation should do. The fact is that few people really care about their sex lives. In 1884, most people didn't care that Grover Cleveland had raped a woman, and lying gets them in trouble. The last section of my book looks at political sex scandals in other nations to compare them to our own scandals. The French in particular see a lusty sex life as evidence of strength, virility, and leadership. When the Monica Lewinsky scandal came out in 1997, the French were utterly mystified by it, and they dubbed it Le Zippergate. One French politician, Christine Boutin, said, "He loves women, this man. It is a sign of good health." Before he became president of France in 1981, Francois Mitterrand lived for many years with his wife and her young lover in a Paris apartment. It shocks American sensibilities to imagine the three of them dipping croissants into their cafe au lait at the breakfast table. We cannot picture, for instance, Bill and Hillary Clinton inviting Monica Lewinsky to live with them and the three buttering their toast together, or Stormy Daniels passing a bowl of scrambled eggs to Melania Trump. Francois, for his part, probably had thousands of lovers, though his skills in bed were not that great. His mistresses called him 5 minutes, shower included. There was one woman, however, whom he loved most of all and with whom he shared decades of family life, Anne Pinjot, pictured here with their daughter Mazarine at Mitterrand's 1996 funeral. And when the French magazine Paris Match revealed the affair and the daughter in 1994, the French people were furious at the magazine for invading the family's privacy. But I will leave you with my favorite French sex scandal of all. In 1899, President Félix IV of France was entertaining his mistress, a 27-year-old socialite named Marguerite Steinheil, when he had a massive heart attack. His hands locked into rigid fists in her hair, an iron grip from which Marguerite could not extricate herself. She called for the guards, who broke down the door, and, summing up the situation, they grabbed a pair of scissors to cut off the hair on the top of her head to free her. The palace descended into an uproar, and the first lady was on her way. So Marguerite grabbed her clothing and, sporting a very unattractive new hairstyle, raced out of the palace. Unfortunately, she left her corset on the floor, which the first lady found. It can be said that Félix IV was one of the few political leaders who came and went at the same time. Thank you so much for your attention. Okay.
Wow. Well, thank you, Eleanor. And where's my own video here?
There I am. Hi.
That is quite, we're all going to need to just chill out for a moment and maybe take a shower, I think, after that.
Right? How do you think I felt writing all this?
Well, I wanted to ask you, so you of course have, I mean, any question I ask is so loaded with double entendre that I'll either apologize or take credit for them before I even begin. But you've already, had a lot of sex there in your earlier books, Sex with Kings, Sex with the Queen. Now you go through 250 years of American history, sex with presidents. You must be getting a little jaded by now, but is there anything that in your presidential inquiries that truly surprised you or shocked you or outraged you or irritated you kind of beyond the norm?
Okay, so what really, going into any book, and you're probably the same way, Rick, I start off with a certain set of assumptions, and I'm invariably proved wrong about some of them, which actually delights me because otherwise it would just be so boring, right? And as I mentioned, I really thought that this strong streak of prudery, priggishness, they all begin with P's, don't they? Puritanism, that it really went right down to the bone of the American spirit when it came to political sex scandals. And I found that it did not. It's definitely there. It's superficial. It's, oh, shame on him. That's disgusting. And, and then people go and vote for their own interests. Who's going to lower my taxes? Right. Who's going to make sure I'm going to have a job? Who's going to provide a brighter future for my kids? That's really it. And you could just, it's always been there since the beginning. But I think in recent decades, it's just like nobody even pretends to care about it anymore.
Well, except in a kind of a, sort of a salacious, interested kind of way. And is that more Americans that have that kind of care? I mean, you alluded to that in your final chapter there and in your final bit of your talk, but are we the only ones who kind of go, oh my God, what the president is doing, that's shocking or that's upsetting? Or is everybody else, the entire rest of the world, not paying attention?
Oh no, human nature being the way it is, I think everybody loves to read about this stuff. And, but the French would read about it with a cigarette in one hand, a coffee in the other, and they would just kind of smile and wink at each other, right? So they wouldn't express the outrage, but I think they would read it just as eagerly as we would.
Do you think that the men who seek to become president, and we are talking about all men here in your
Oh,
book,
yes.
are more likely to be kind of thrill-seeking, risky sex, adventure, pursuit people than just a run-of-the-mill guy? And if so, why?
Well, my personal opinion is that um, anyone who runs for president of this country is probably sort of crazy to begin with. I mean, what normal person would want to do that? And I think it attracts a certain type of man who has a great deal of ego. I mean, you'd have to, right? And narcissism. And then when they obtain such great power, there's something that kicks in called hubris syndrome. It's a psychological disorder that was just discovered like 10 years ago, that it only starts when you have great power, and then it fades when your power is taken away from you. So I think in many cases, people really, they don't listen to anybody. They think they're, God's appointed on earth to do whatever they want. And I think that risky sex is part of it. It gives them a thrill that they can get away with whatever they want.
Now, your book, the thrust of your book, pardon the pun, is a focus on 10, I think 10 presidents. I'm close there, and Alexander Hamilton.
Uh-huh.
So, are these like the real bad boys, or are they just the tip of an iceberg, and we don't know about everybody else?
Yeah, I think that's it. We don't really know about everybody else. I think we know about them in the 20th century, but I think in the 19th century there were just so many presidents, and if they had a girlfriend on the side, the journalists certainly would not have covered it towards the end of the century, and or maybe nobody ever heard about it. So I think there's probably more there, but I just didn't have any evidence.
Right. So if Franklin Pierce or Martin Van Buren had a crazy sex lives, we're just probably never gonna. They've managed to cover it up.
Right. I think so. Like some of them did. I don't know which ones. That's the problem.
I'm going to encourage everyone to put your questions up in the Q&A area, and I'm going to get to some of those shortly. I wanted to ask you, you mentioned Alice Glass, who had an affair with Lyndon Johnson, and I wanted to ask you a question about that because I was quite fascinated with that story and a very telling passage in it. And I want to say parenthetically that your book is not simply salacious stories. There's a lot in there about the man, about the presidency, about how the story fits in and sort of what it all means. And I think that that's important for people to know. There's some real meat in that book, and that is not a double entendre pun. But there's this woman, Alice Glass, had an affair with Lyndon Johnson, and she was the mistress of a man who was essentially one of Johnson's mentors, Charles Marsh, who was a wealthy publisher. And Marsh discovered the affair. And he was angry, obviously, I think, as one might assume that a powerful man might be, that this young man he's taken on as a kind of a project had an affair with his mistress. And you write that Lyndon Johnson came to him and apologized, and that the two men continued that their relationship, their apology was accepted. And you write that Marsh's daughter, Antoinette Marsh Haskell, said they didn't let her come between them. Men in power like that don't give a damn about women. And I just found that really telling, because I think that some of what goes on here is, in fact, sort of it's classified by these powerful guys as, well, involves a woman. It's not really important.
In my book, there are all kinds of stories. Like the tragedy of 19-year-old Mimi Beardsley, who lost her virginity. And JFK, I could have punched the guy. I mean, it was just disgusting. It was just gross. He would have sex in a room with his two brothers and three women, and then they would split. I mean, having sex in a room with it was mind-boggling. So there was a lot of like just disturbing, gross stuff, but there was also some real love stories. For instance, Nan Britton just loved Warren Harding so much, and just reading her memoir, I just felt so badly for her that he died, and she had no money for her child. And then Kay Summersby just loved Eisenhower, and there was this love between Lucy Mercer and FDR. So these, they're just human stories. I mean, there's really not much sex. It's mainly human relationships. And I find that when you take, that's why I've written all of these books about powerful people. When you take human relationships and then you put them in the pinnacle of power, it's like heating water. It's like comes to a rolling boil, right? Like the stories are just more interesting.
So I want to turn to some of the questions that people have asked us about. And we have a couple of people who are asking about basically how you found all this stuff out, how you found the information, what your sources were, how you checked it out and made sure that it was all true.
All right. So I should begin by saying that my expertise was mostly in European history. And, I'd written all these books about royal palaces and crown jewels and kings and queens, and I really love that. And I really had to delve deep into American history. And I'm glad I did. I learned so many fascinating things about my own country's history. So in terms of the philandering, I started off, there are some general books about, presidential sex scandals. And so I read about, JFK, I think a dozen women who had sex with JFK wrote about it, right? So I read them, and then they would mention, oh, he was worse than Warren Harding. I'm thinking Warren Harding. Well, I better look up that one.
Mm-hmm.
And so it just one led to the other. There are letters in the case of Hamilton and Jefferson and Cleveland. There were all of these newspaper articles, right, that are a matter of public record, and so it is well documented. And I have several pages of a very detailed bibliography in the back.
We had a question that someone put forward to us. Have you found any indiscretions in the lives of either President Bush or Carter or Nixon? I'm going to guess the answer is no, since if you found them, you would have put them in.
No for Carter, though he lusted in his heart. Nixon in the early 60s had an affair with a Hong Kong cocktail lounge hostess. He would go over there periodically for trade missions, business, I don't know, whatever. And so they had a relationship, and it rose to the attention of J. Edgar Hoover, because this woman, while earning basically minimum wage, owned all this property, and her best friend was her best friend's father was a red Chinese general, and so they thought she was a spy, and so that was very, very upsetting. And so Carter, no. Who was the other one? Bush. Yes, the first Bush had a long-term affair, maybe 20 years, with his secretary, Jennifer Fitzgerald. Yeah.
You mentioned Carter, but we should mention there definitely were some very straight-laced U.S. presidents as well. You write about John and Abigail Adams.
Oh God, yes.
And I think of Harry Truman and his wife, and I mean, there definitely been some people who were Jimmy Carter, who treaded the straight and narrow, and you could look all day and not find anything on them.
Right. I mean, the Adamses were funny because they would write each other. They loved looking at other people's sex lives and then writing each other scandalized letters like, "Oh my God, it's disgusting. I see the devil in his eyes. He's seducing all the women." I think they enjoyed that sort of thing.
And so I want to remind everybody that we're talking here with Eleanor Herman, who's the author of Sex with Presidents, and we are happy to take any of the other questions that you have here that we might be able to put to her. I was wondering, you suggested the possibility that you were talking a little bit about, you have to be crazy to be president. And so maybe you have to be kind of crazy to be pursuing women in this way. And when I look at John Kennedy, And I mean, I knew that Kennedy had affairs, and I usually kind of skipped over some of that stuff, but I started to wonder how the man had time, don't you think, to run the country?
Well, I'll tell you how he had time, because each time he had sex, it was like 60 seconds or less.
Okay, but I still, when I added up all the times, it seemed like
If he did that 2 or 3 times a day, he'd have a woman come in and the whole thing would be less than 5 minutes. And, he had a very bad back. So he'd lie back and he really, didn't make much effort. And then it was done and he could get back to his state papers, I guess.
Was there any president that you ended up being, I guess you talked about Harding, but particularly sympathetic to in terms of saying, well, they did this and maybe I should be shocked by their behavior, but I really kind of understand them and feel like I get them.
Yeah, Harding was one. He was a nice guy. He had no business being president. He sort of became president by mistake. He was at the right place at the right time, or perhaps it was the wrong place at the wrong time. And so he was just a good old boy. He liked to smoke cigars and play poker and go around with women. And when he became president, it was the Secret Service, and his wife's always, keeping track of him in the White House and screaming at him, "You're not leaving this White House tonight, Warren." And he complained to Nan Britton, his mistress, that he felt like he was in jail and he hated his life. And one night the butler found him out sitting on the White House lawn, just sobbing, saying he wanted to die. He hated the job so much.
Oh.
And then when he started to hear that his friends had been stealing money from the government, that I think that may have hastened his death. He was only in his 50s, and he had a heart attack. Yeah.
And Warren Harding is the president who was chosen in a smoke-filled room at the Blackstone Hotel.
Yeah.
Just about a half mile down the street from my house.
I also developed a great fondness for FDR. He was a man of such amazing character. When he got polio in 1921, and back then, if you were that physically handicapped, I mean, they would just put you away for life. No one would want to have anything to do with you. And he worked so hard to overcome that, and he even fashioned himself a way of walking if he was leaning on his son's arm. And to get us through the Great Depression and through World War II, and his marriage was just very difficult for both him and Eleanor, that I can't begrudge him a couple of love affairs to just to make life worth it with everything he had going on.
Now, my last question probably for you is, what about when we get women presidents? Okay, because I was thinking about this as I was reading your book, and oddly enough, I thought about an interview I'd heard with the one of the members of the band Heart, which was women, all women, and the interviewer said, "Did you have like teenage boy groupies who wanted to like hang out with you after the show?" And she's like, "No." It's not a phenomenon. If we get a woman president, what's the story going to be?
Well, I read in my research that women generally don't have the ego narcissism thing going when they enter politics the way men do. Many men enter politics because they want to be somebody. They're going to beat their breasts. Look at me. Most women enter politics because they want to help somebody. So they want to have better schools for kids, or help senior citizens, or the underprivileged. And I also think, because I was really trying to find female leaders of countries that had sordid love affairs, and I couldn't. I mean, look at Margaret Thatcher, look at Golda Meir, look at Angela Merkel. I mean, where is it's
making me laugh?
It's not there, right? So I think when we finally do have a female president, it's just not going to happen, and I won't be able to write any books at all about that kind of thing.
Well, that is unfortunate for you as an author, but
maybe
probably
better for the country, right?
Great thing for the country. I want to thank you, Eleanor, and remind everybody again, Eleanor Herman, author of the book Sex with Presidents. I have my copy here, so I'll hold it up so that you can see it. Terrific book. I urge you to check it out. The library has a deal where you can buy one that's autographed, and of course you can find it in all places where books are sold. Eleanor, great job today. Thank you so much for joining us for this presentation.